Would you believe? A 71-year-old man once risked his life to save a creature, half human, half beast, from drowning beneath a frozen lake, and ended up loving it like his own child. Out in the wilderness, where no one was watching, just snow, blood, and the last flicker of human kindness, something impossible happened. The truth is, Bigfoot isn't just a myth. They feel, they have families, and they're being hunted like monsters. One widowed war veteran went against everything, his past, the world's disbelief, to hide one of them in an old bomb shelter, the same way he once buried the scars of war. This story was reconstructed from real journals, undeveloped film rolls, and voice tapes never released outside of Montana. Until now. Stay with us, and you'll learn why Mika, the creature he saved, came back after winter with 3 young ones by her side, and how Walter, a man who had lived 4 decades in silence, finally found family. Not through people, but through the sacred wild. Walter Remington, a 71-year-old veteran who couldn't save his brothers in arms from the firestorm of '69, saved Micah. And that changed everything. He rebuilt the cabin from ash, gave names to the young ones, Ember, Moss, Echo, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone anymore. If you've ever thought Bigfoot was just a bedtime story, don't skip this video. Because sometimes, miracles don't come from the world of men. They come from the forest, waiting for someone to believe again. The lake was breathing. That's what it looked like. Out past the old spruce trees, where the ice cracked just slightly under the weight of dusk. A soft groan, a shift in light, then silence again. That kind of silence that seeps into your bones, not empty but full of things that used to be. Walter Remington sat by the window of his cabin, the glass fogged slightly by his breath, the corner chipped from a storm 6 years back. The cabin leaned into the wind like an old dog curling to sleep, its wood darkened by time and smoke. He didn't mind. He built it himself. Every nail, every board, every creak underfoot was a piece of his own body, his own past. He lit the oil lamp. The amber glow stretched across the floor, brushing past the bookshelf stacked with faded war novels, across the framed photo of his wife, Mary, smiling in her nurse's uniform, to the far wall where the radio sat silent. It hadn't worked in years, but that didn't stop Walter from talking to it. "Clear skies tonight," he murmured, adjusting the dial like someone tuning memory. "Low near 10. Might get snow by morning." He chuckled at himself. The kind of laugh that never quite reaches the chest. No one answered. They hadn't in a long time. Outside, the wind changed. The smell of pine gave way to something colder, crisper, a breath before winter. Walter stood, joints stiff with November, and reached for the wool coat hanging on the nail by the door. It still held the scent of old campfires and cedar oil. He slipped it on, pulled the collar up. Time to check the fish traps one last time before the lake froze over completely. The rowboat moaned against the dock as he stepped in. Wood on ice. Water lapping gently beneath. Not quite frozen. Not quite fluid. He pushed off with one strong leg, the oar creaking, his breath visible under the bruised sky. Across Crystal Hollow Lake, the horizon burned low, gold fading into violet, like an ember giving up the fight. Halfway to the second trap, he paused. A sound. Wet, sharp, desperate. He turned his head slowly, squinting into the shifting dark. There, a splash. Not the casual plunk of a bird diving or a branch falling. This was heavier, unnatural. He rowed without thinking, not fast, but with purpose. The kind of movement that came from instinct built over decades, when you know something's not right, but you're already too close to stop. The ice had cracked near the middle of the lake. Thin, dark veins radiated outward like something had tried to claw its way through. Walter's breath caught. Floating, barely above water, was something not right. Long arms, no, longer than they should be, reached weakly for the broken edge. Fur clung to the body in soaked clumps. The head sagged low, too heavy to lift. Walter's hands moved before his mind caught up. He dropped the oar, grabbed the boat hook, and pulled closer. Whatever it wasn't human. But it wasn't an animal either, and God help him, he didn't care. He reached out, the boat rocking dangerously, his knee pressed to the bench for balance. Another sound, barely audible, like a breath that forgot how to leave the lungs. Their hands touched. It didn't grab, it didn't claw. It just rested there. The skin beneath the fur was ice cold. The fingers were long, thick-knuckled, with nails dulled by exhaustion. Walter tightened his grip and hauled. The weight was shocking. But he had pulled men out of fire. He had carried bodies out of war. This was not going to stop him. The creature slumped into the boat, soaking it instantly, the smell of forest and blood, and something ancient filling the space between them. Walter stared, chest heaving. Its eyes were closed, but its chest moved, barely. He didn't think. He rowed, faster than he had in years. Water sloshed with each pull. The cabin's yellow window came into view. The boat scraped the dock, but he didn't tie it. He dragged the creature across the ice-dusted planks, arms shaking from adrenaline and disbelief. Inside, the cabin groaned at the intrusion. Walter dropped to his knees by the fire and reached for the old quilt on the rocking chair. He wrapped it tight around the body, hands steady, the same way he'd once held Mary when the chemo left her shivering. He stoked the fire. The creature didn't stir. Steam began to rise from its fur. Walter sat back, wiping his face. The oil lamp flickered. The shadows danced across the walls like ghosts. He should have been scared, but all he felt was a strange, hollow calm. The way you feel when you realize something impossible has already happened, and now all that's left is to deal with it. He pulled another log from the basket. Then something caught his eye. Around the creature's neck, barely visible under the tangled wet fur, was a thin strip of bark, wound tightly into a braid, and threaded through it, a carved sliver of dark wood, weathered, smoothed by time. It wasn't jewelry. It was a sign, a token, something made. Walter leaned in, heart knocking hard against his ribs. He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but he knew what it wasn't. This thing, this being, it hadn't just wandered here. It came from somewhere, someone, and Walter Remington, alone beside the fire, surrounded by memories and smoke and the quiet creak of timber, whispered the words before he even realized he was saying them. "I got you." The wind picked up outside. The lake groaned again, but inside that little cabin on the edge of the wilderness, something ancient had been pulled back from the edge. And something inside Walter, something long buried, had stirred. Not everything had to be understood. Some things only had to be kept warm, alive. And tonight, that was enough. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and damp fur. Walter moved slowly across the floor, the quilt dragging behind him like a shadow, soaked and heavy, leaving a faint trail of melted snow and blood on the worn planks. The fire hissed as it swallowed a new log, light dancing off the stone hearth and brushing over the motionless figure curled tight on the rug. It was still breathing, just barely, chest rising in short, shallow pulses like it was afraid to take too much air, like the world would punish it for surviving. He knelt beside it again, heart thudding, not from fear, but something deeper, something that felt like obligation mixed with awe. The creature hadn't stirred since he'd pulled it from the lake. He didn't know how long it had been in that water or what part of these woods it had come from. What he did know was this: it had fought to stay above the ice, and when it couldn't fight anymore, it had reached out for him. Not with violence, not with instinct, but with trust. Walter dipped the cloth into the pot of warm water simmering near the fire, wrung it out slowly, and began cleaning the wound along its shoulder. The fur peeled back, thick and matted with blood and grit. Underneath, the skin was raw and torn. Flesh not unlike his own, though darker, thicker, more calloused. His hands were steady, years of experience guiding each motion. He'd stitched wounds in battlefields, He'd cleaned burns off men's backs. But this was something else. Something sacred. He didn't speak. Didn't ask what it was, or why it looked the way it did. He just worked, letting the fire crackle and the night drift in slow outside. Snow began to fall again, the soft kind, weightless, a whisper on the roof. When he finished dressing the last of the wounds, he fetched the second quilt from the back room, the one Mary had crocheted before her hair fell out for the last time. He hadn't touched it in years. Couldn't. But tonight, it felt right. He laid it gently over the creature's body, tucking the edges near its neck. It didn't flinch. Its eyes stayed shut. But as he pulled back, its arm twitched. Then something happened that stopped Walter mid-breath. The creature's hand, broad and strange and splayed, reached out and gently wrapped around his wrist. It didn't grip, didn't hold tight, just touched him, palm to skin, as if to say thank you or don't go. Walter sat there, frozen, watching the way its fingers shook against his own. The fire crackled behind them. Shadows shifted. Something old stirred in his chest, the kind of ache that lived in silence for so long it had no name anymore. He didn't pull away. Outside, the wind moved low across the trees, rattling the frost from the pine boughs. Inside, the moment held like glass, not yet broken, not yet understood. After some time, the creature's hand fell back to the floor. Walter stood, slow, back stiff and knees sore, and crossed to the small cupboard near the sink. He rummaged until he found an old metal bowl and filled it with water. Then he opened the lower drawer where he kept the dried jerky and oats. He paused, then added a small scoop of Mary's canned apples, syrupy and soft, the last jar left untouched since her funeral. He placed the bowl beside the creature, just within reach, then settled in his rocker across the fire, eyes fixed on it. He didn't expect it to move, didn't expect anything, but he sat, like he used to sit for hours beside Mary when she couldn't speak anymore, just to let her know she wasn't alone. Time passed strange after that. The night didn't tick forward, it drifted. At some point, long after the fire had mellowed and the snow had piled thick against the window sills, the creature stirred again. A soft rustle, a shift in breath. Then, slowly, it opened its eyes. Walter held his breath. They were dark, those eyes, but not dull, not wild either. They blinked with something behind them, something watching back. The creature didn't panic, didn't try to move. It just looked at him, long and deep, like it was memorizing his face. Walter leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "You're safe now." The creature blinked once. Then, almost cautiously, it reached for the bowl and pulled it close. It didn't eat right away. It glanced at Walter, waited, only when he nodded. Just slightly did it bring the food to its mouth. That moment cracked something open in him. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the patience. Maybe it was the way it waited for his permission. Or maybe it was just the sound, the soft chewing, the proof of life, the reminder that something he thought was lost to the woods had made its way back. Later, as the fire burned low, Walter noticed the necklace again. The little strip of bark braided tight, still damp but intact, with that wooden shard tied in the center. He leaned in closer, his hand hovering just above it. The carving wasn't random. It had shape, symmetry, the kind of lines you didn't find in nature. Someone made this, by hand, with care, not to mark ownership, but to honor something. He didn't touch it. Instead, he sat back and looked at the creature again. It had finished the food, curled back beneath the quilts, watching him with one eye half-lidded. "You're not just some animal," Walter said quietly, more to himself than anything. The creature didn't answer, but it didn't need to. There was something in the room now, a tension that wasn't fear, a stillness that wasn't silence. He didn't sleep that night. He stayed by the fire, watching over it, as the snow kept falling and the cabin grew colder and the night grew long. And somewhere before dawn, Walter found himself whispering to the dark, "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." He didn't know where the words came from, but once they were said, they sat heavy in the air, like a promise etched into stone. In the gray hush before morning, he finally drifted off in the rocker, one hand still open toward the hearth, as if reaching for something already too far to hold. Outside, the forest watched back, and somewhere in that vast white wilderness, something else was listening. The fire had burned low by morning, nothing left but a cradle of coals and a steady glow along the stone hearth. Walter stirred in his rocker, neck stiff, mouth dry, the ache of age pressed into every joint like winter had made a home beneath his skin. The cabin was cold, quiet. Frost had crept across the windows like pale veins, casting a soft blue hush over the room. The quilt still covered the creature on the floor, unmoved save for the rhythmic rise and fall beneath the fabric. Walter blinked, slow, unsure if he dreamt the whole damn thing. But then it shifted. Not much, just a slow stretch under the quilt, one arm sliding out, hand splayed wide against the pine floorboards like it was remembering gravity. Then a low, strained sound, half sigh, half growl, from deep in its chest. Walter leaned forward, breath held tight. The creature stirred again, and this time it lifted its head. For the first time, Walter saw its eyes in the full light of day. They weren't wild. They weren't blind either. They held something aware, something watching him just as carefully as he was watching back. No flinch, no teeth. Just that long, quiet stare between two beings who didn't understand each other, but knew not to break the moment. Walter stood and crossed the room, keeping his steps slow, deliberate, the way you'd approach a horse that doesn't quite trust you yet. He grabbed the water bowl from the night before, refilled it at the old tin sink, and set it down again within arm's reach. The creature blinked. Then, like yesterday, it waited, watched. Walter crouched beside it, knees popping. He didn't say anything this time, didn't want to spook it with his voice. Instead, he just nodded once, gentle, steady, then backed away. The creature reached for the bowl and drank. Walter felt something unspool in his chest. A tiny knot, held there for years, maybe decades. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, like the quiet crack of ice before the thaw. That day passed in fragments. He kept the fire going, restocked the woodpile, brewed strong black coffee, and kept an eye on the creature from the corners of the cabin. It didn't try to move far, still too weak, but it watched everything. The way Walter cleaned the stove, the way he layered the kindling, the way he folded Mary's quilt back across the rocker when the light changed angles. It was learning, absorbing, like a child trapped in something far older than its body. He didn't have a name for it yet, and somehow it didn't feel right to call it a thing. Later, near dusk, Walter pulled out one of his old poetry books, the battered one with pages marked by fingerprints and spilled whiskey, and sat by the hearth to read. His voice was soft, cracking on the vowels. He read to the fire, mostly, but he knew the creature was listening. Then something happened that stopped his words mid-sentence. A movement, slow, deliberate. The creature had raised its hand again, but not to grab, not to defend. It reached forward and touched the corner of the book, just the edge. One finger, barely grazing the leather binding like it recognized the weight of words, even if it couldn't read them. Walter's breath caught. His eyes stung for reasons he didn't understand. He turned the page, kept reading. By nightfall, the creature had pulled itself into a sitting position, still hunched, still weak, but upright. It watched the fire like it remembered fire, not feared it, not puzzled by it, just respected it. That night, Walter gave it a name, Micah, he said softly as he poured water into the basin. Like the stone. You ever seen mica? Shimmers in the dark, crumbles easy but still, hard to break. He didn't expect a response, didn't need one. But the creature blinked, slow, deliberate. Then lowered its head. The name stuck. In the days that followed, Micah began to change, not just healing, though the wound scabbed over fast, startling fast, but in behavior. It started to move more. Small steps. Slow, careful turns of the head when Walter entered a room. Sometimes it stood near the window, one hand pressed to the glass, watching the trees like it was waiting for something out there to return. It didn't make much sound, but it began mimicking little gestures, the way Walter stirred his coffee, the way he rubbed his chest when he got cold. Once, he caught Mika trying to open the door with surprising precision, its fingers on the latch like it had seen it done 100 times before. There was a quiet intelligence in everything it did. Not human, not animal. Something older, something layered. He caught it staring at the map once. The big paper one pinned to the wall with rusty tacks. The one showing the ridgelines of Bitterroot and beyond. Micah stood in front of it for nearly an hour, not touching, just watching. Every now and then its fingers would twitch, like it was tracing paths invisible to the eye. Walter didn't interrupt, didn't ask. He just watched too, feeling more like a guest in his own home with every passing day. One evening, Walter stepped outside to split more wood. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that bit deep and stayed. He heard something then, a sound that didn't belong. Not near, far off from the forest. A call, long, hollow, bone deep. It didn't sound like a coyote. Didn't sound like any elk, bear, or wolf he'd ever known. It sounded lonely. He turned toward the tree line, axe still in hand, and listened. Inside the cabin, Micah stood up. Not slowly, not lazily, but fast. Alert. Its chest rose with sharp, panicked breaths. It stared toward the back wall, toward the woods, and its whole body tensed. Walter stepped back in, closing the door behind him. Micah hadn't moved, but its eyes were wide now, breath ragged, arms close to its chest like it was bracing for something it couldn't name. Walter didn't speak. He knew what fear looked like. He'd seen it in soldiers, in fire victims, in Mary's eyes the night she first said the word terminal, and he was seeing it now. This wasn't fear of pain. This was fear of being found. Whatever Mika was, whoever had made that sound out there, it wasn't over. And whatever story had found its way to his doorstep was just beginning to open its eyes. The morning light came in pale and quiet, filtering through the frost-laced windows like it was afraid to disturb anything inside. Walter stepped outside in his boots, the soles pressing down into the new snow with a soft crunch. His breath rose in plumes. Somewhere behind him, inside the cabin, Micah still slept, curled near the fireplace like a wild animal trying to remember the shape of safety. The storm had passed overnight, leaving a thin, brittle calm across the hollow. Birds hadn't started their songs yet. The lake was frozen tight. Everything stood still, but not everything was where it had been. He saw it right away, near the woodpile. Tracks, not Micah's. Too big, too far apart. The snow around them compressed deep like someone heavy had stepped deliberately through the clearing, all the way to the back of the cabin, then around toward the tree line. Walter crouched down, his hand hovering just above the nearest print. Not boot, not paw, not anything he'd seen before. 5 toes, thick pad, slight claw curve. Whatever made these walked upright, not running, not rushing, but not wandering either. These steps meant something. He followed them halfway around the cabin, pulse tightening in his neck. They circled once, just once, and then vanished into the forest. No drag marks, no sudden shift in pace. Just gone. He turned back to the cabin. Micah was standing in the doorway, silent, still, eyes dark, shoulders pulled back like he was trying not to look afraid, but failing. Walter didn't say a word, just looked at him. The creature looked back, then stepped outside, bare feet pressing gently into the snow without a flinch. He walked up to one of the prints and stared, then lowered himself slowly, one hand brushing over the indentation, barely touching. His breathing changed, not faster, deeper, like something inside had shifted. Walter watched him place his hand on his own chest, then tap the ground, then look toward the ridge. A gesture, not human, not rehearsed, but loaded. Something out there had been close. Something Mika knew. That day passed slow. They didn't speak. Not that there were words to bridge what sat between them, but something in the air had changed. Walter noticed Mika's gaze more now. The way he stared at the trees through the window just before dawn, like waiting for someone to step out of them. The way his ears perked at the smallest sound, branches snapping, wind shifting, a pine cone falling from high up. Not flinching, listening. Walter made a bed by the window that night. Layers of wool, some torn clothes he no longer wore, pine straw dried and bundled tight. Micah took to it right away, curled into it without hesitation. As he settled in, he made a sound Walter hadn't heard before, somewhere between a sigh and a hum, almost like a whisper in the trees. It was soft, repeating, a pattern. It took Walter a minute to realize. It was laughter. A kind of laughter anyway. Not like a man, not like a dog, but real. It startled him. He looked over and saw Micah smiling. Not a baring of teeth, just a faint pull at the corners of his mouth, a softness around the eyes. That sound again. Not joy, exactly. Something smaller, more fragile. A memory, maybe, returning like a scent you thought you forgot. Walter sat down near the fire, not speaking. He didn't want to break it. The next morning, Mika stood before the fireplace, clutching the small wooden token from his neck. He turned it over and over in his hands, like someone trying to remember why they were given something. Then, very slowly, he pressed it against his chest, held it there with both hands, eyes closed, not blinking. A long breath came out of him, low and almost trembling. It was a gesture of something sacred, not habit, not survival. Something deeper, a ritual, maybe, or a prayer. Walter had no frame of reference for it, but he knew better than to interrupt. That afternoon, the wind shifted, warm enough for the snow to drip slowly from the roof, tapping steady onto the porch. Walter went out back to check the traps he hadn't touched in a week. No fish, but something else caught his attention. Out near the tree line, a smear of red in the snow. He walked toward it, slow. Blood. Not fresh, but not frozen all the way. And beside it, a clump of hair, long, coarse, gray-brown like Micah's, but matted with soot, burnt at the ends. Walter looked around. The trees stood silent, watching. He crouched down, picked up the fur, brought it close to his face. There was a smell he recognized. Not just blood, smoke, ash, grease maybe. Something manufactured, something wrong. He didn't speak of it when he got back to the cabin. But that night, while Mika slept by the window, Walter pulled out his old box from the war. Not the one with medals, the other one. The one he kept tucked behind the stovepipe in the crawl space. Inside were a few things he never planned to use again. A folding knife, a rusted compass, a box of ammo long expired, and an old black and white photo of a man with a cigarette in his teeth and a scar across his eyebrow. Walter stared at the photo a long time before putting it away. Then he turned to Mika, who was awake now, watching him. They didn't speak, but something had passed between them anyway. Later that night, long after the oil lamp burned down to a blue whisper, a cry echoed across the ridge. Low, wounded, cut off at the end. Micah sat up fast. His chest moved heavy. He looked at Walter, not like a child, not like an animal, but like someone asking, silently, "What are we going to do now?" Walter didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because whatever this thing was, whatever had found its way to his cabin, whatever it had run from, whatever had walked in circles around them in the snow, wasn't done yet. And something told him it wasn't just coming for Micah. It was getting closer. The knock came just before dawn. 3 slow thuds against the front door. Confident, unhurried, like whoever stood there didn't care if he was invited in or not. Walter froze mid-pour, coffee sloshing in his tin cup. The cabin, usually thick with the sounds of a settling structure, timbers creaking, wind pressing at the corners, had gone still. The kind of stillness that listens. He glanced at the fireplace. Micah had already backed into the farthest corner, crouched low, fingers curled against the floor, his breath shallow and silent. His eyes locked on the door like he already knew what was on the other side. Walter took one step toward the rifle above the mantel, then stopped himself. No sound from outside, just the weight of presence. He opened the door slowly, keeping his stance square, his face unreadable. The man who stood there looked like he'd been carved out of the woods themselves. Tall, lean, dressed in old army surplus, camo pants tucked into boots crusted with frozen mud, jacket faded, patchless. His face was ruddy, wind-chapped. He smelled like diesel and cold metal. No smile, just eyes that flicked past Walter's shoulder into the dim cabin behind him. "You live here full-time?" he asked. His voice was flat, too neutral to be friendly. "Off the lake." Walter nodded once. "Been up this way before," the man continued. "Back in the 60s. Hell of a view." Walter didn't answer. The man shifted slightly, glancing at the woods beyond the cabin. "You see anything strange lately?" he asked. Casual, like he was asking about the weather. "Heard some stories out of Missoula. Thought I'd take a look for myself." Walter's spine tightened. "No," he said. "Just snow, squirrels, coyotes maybe." The man's gaze lingered on him a moment too long. Then he gave a quick nod and turned back toward the trail. But he didn't go far. Walter watched from the window as the stranger moved into the trees. Moments later, 3 others emerged from the ridge, all dressed the same. One carried a scoped rifle over his shoulder. Another held what looked like a thermographic unit, military grade, not store-bought. No one laughed, no one talked. They moved like they had a purpose, like they weren't looking for something, but hunting it. That night, Walter led Micah into the root cellar beneath the cabin. The hatch had been sealed since the Cold War, just in case, he used to say. And now here he was again, pulling the boards loose with his crowbar, coughing through the dust. The space below was narrow, lined with shelves of canned beans and rusted lanterns. He laid down 2 blankets, passed Micah a canteen and a wool coat. Micah didn't speak, had never spoken, but his eyes searched Walter's face like he was looking for a reason not to be afraid. Walter gripped his shoulder gently, then closed the hatch. Later, as night fell and the wind picked up, headlights swept across the trees, faint at first, then closer. A truck engine growled outside. Walter stayed still, shotgun in hand, back pressed to the wall beside the door. He counted 3 voices, one low, muffled, one barking orders, one laughing in a way that didn't carry humor. Flashlights beamed through the windows. He heard footsteps crunching snow around the back, then silence. Then a sound that turned his gut, something metallic clicking against glass, a camera lens maybe, or the muzzle of a rifle tapping the pane. Walter didn't move. They stood there a long time. Then, just like that, they left. But the silence they left behind wasn't clean. It stayed thick in the cabin, like smoke after a fire. The next morning, Walter took Micah deeper into the woods. Not far, but far enough to keep him out of sight. A hollow beneath an old cedar, hidden behind brush. He set up a crude lean-to, left food, water, blankets, just for now, he whispered, his hand resting on Micah's shoulder. "Stay quiet. Don't come out till I say." Micah nodded once, slow. Walter turned back toward the cabin, but something tugged at him. He looked back. Micah stood still, holding the wooden token from his neck. The cord had come loose. Walter reached to help tie it again, but then he noticed something. A mark, burned faintly into the wood. Some sort of symbol. He narrowed his eyes. A curved shape, a line through the center. Familiar. He'd seen that before. In Korea, maybe. No, earlier. It hit him like a slap. The tattoo. One of the men yesterday, when he turned, reaching for something in his coat, his sleeve had ridden up. Same mark. Same goddamn mark. It wasn't military. It wasn't tribal. It was older than that. He stepped back from Micah, heart thudding. This wasn't just about tracking a rare animal. This was something else. Something orchestrated. This wasn't a hunt. It was an erasure. They were looking to wipe something out. Walter sat by the fire that night, alone, his hands trembling around his coffee mug. He stared at the door, then at the window. Every creak in the wood felt like a breath on his neck. He thought about the man he couldn't save in the fire, Dennis, from his station back in Livingston. The way his scream still echoed in Walter's dreams. The way Walter had run into the inferno twice and still couldn't bring him out. That helplessness had etched itself into his marrow. And now here it was again, only this time the flames were different, colder, smarter. He stood, went to his old writing desk, and pulled out a yellowed notepad. He wrote a note. Ink scratched across the page, slow, deliberate. If I don't return, check the cedar hollow. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, but it was something worth saving. He folded it, set it under Mary's framed photo, then loaded his shotgun. He didn't know if he'd make it back. But he knew this. Whatever those men were, whatever they were after, it wasn't justice, it wasn't science, it was silence. And Walter Remington had already buried too much to let the truth die in these woods too. Outside, the cold settled in. The lake cracked under the weight of the night. Somewhere beyond the ridge, engines started again, and this time, they weren't passing through. The photograph burned slowly, edges curled inward first, like the past was trying to protect itself from the flame. Then the smile in Mary's eyes darkened, turned to smoke, vanished. Walter didn't look away. He held the old Polaroid steady with a pair of fire tongs, letting the ash fall quietly into the wood stove. When the last corner turned black, he reached for the envelope already sealed and slipped it inside his coat. His hands moved slow, but not hesitant. He'd made up his mind. He sat at the small desk, cracked leather chair groaning beneath him, and began to write. Each line in his firm, uneven script. Words carved more than written. No apologies. Just what mattered. If I don't return, he wrote, there's nothing to be sorry for. He folded the page, slid it under the lantern base on the table, right next to Mary's mug. It still smelled faintly of chamomile and cedar wax. He didn't touch it. The morning wind howled against the cabin walls, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were already in the ridges, in the deep woods where the map ended and the names thinned out to whispers. That's where he had to go. No choice now. He'd built this life in isolation, brick by brick, but the world had pushed back in. And it wasn't leaving empty-handed. The duffel was ready by the door. Canteen, dried food, extra socks, his old Colt in a leather holster. He tucked the wooden token Mika wore into the inner pocket of his coat, wrapping it in cloth so the edges wouldn't splinter. When he opened the cellar door, the cold swept in like a ghost. Micah stood at the bottom of the steps, back pressed to the wall, face half in shadow. He didn't move, not at first. His eyes were tired, but clear. We can't stay, Walter said, voice low. They're not just searching anymore, they're circling, watching, every night. Micah blinked once. There's a place, Walter continued. High ground, northwest ridge. I've only been up there once. Locals used to call it the heart of the forest. Micah stepped forward. I don't know what's waiting up there, Walter said. But I know it's not here. They left just before dawn. The snow was shallow enough to move fast. Their tracks vanished quickly behind them, wind doing them a favor for once. Micah stayed close, his steps silent, moving like he knew the route already. Walter carried the duffel over one shoulder, shotgun strapped across his back. Every now and then, Mika would glance behind them. Walter didn't ask what he saw. He didn't want confirmation of what he already knew. They climbed through the pines, past the old creek bed that hadn't run since '82. Ice still clung to the rocks, crusted like bone. Crows followed for a while, black smudges against the gray sky. No calls, just watching. By midday, they reached the first ridge. Walter's breath came harder now, but his legs held steady. Years of fighting fire had carved strength into his muscles that time hadn't fully taken. He found a downed tree near the overlook and sat. Micah crouched nearby, chewing slowly on the dried venison Walter had packed. Walter stared out at the valley below. He could see the faint smoke trails from town, miles off. Too far to help. Close enough to burn. "You ever been this far?" he asked. Micah didn't answer, just stared straight ahead. The silence between them wasn't empty. It never had been. As the sun dipped lower, the trees thinned. They passed through what had once been a native encampment, long abandoned. Only stone outlines of fire rings remained, scattered like forgotten prayers. The wind carried something else now, drier, older, not rot, not decay, something sacred, like wood never meant to be burned. They reached the final incline by late afternoon. The ridge rose sharp and steady, dusted with moss and quartz flecks. Walter felt his knees protest, but he didn't stop. Micah was already ahead, waiting for him at the edge of the cliff. And then, without warning, he turned back, held out his hand. Walter gripped it. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, and looked down into the hollowed basin below. What lay there wasn't a clearing. It wasn't a village. It wasn't anything Walter could name, but it was shaped, marked. Stones set in spirals, symbols scratched into bark, trees bent in deliberate arcs, all pointing toward the same center, a shallow pool, still unfrozen despite the season. Micah stepped forward, knelt beside the water, and unwrapped the token from Walter's coat. He pressed it to his chest again, and then, without sound, he laid it on a flat stone and stepped back. Walter lowered himself beside him. He reached into his own shirt pocket, pulled out the scrap of red yarn Mary had used to tie her garden stakes back in the early 70s. It was all he had left of that patch of earth. He laid it beside the token. Something shifted in the trees. He turned quickly, thought he saw movement, but it wasn't the men. Not yet. Micah stood, and Walter understood. This wasn't just hiding. It was returning. Returning to something older than violence, older than man, older than the idea of being hunted. Before they turned back, Walter looked once more at the ridge. Snow began to fall again, soft as breath. The trees swallowed the sky. Somewhere below, he knew, they would find the fire already lit. Not of flame, of memory. They didn't speak the rest of the way. But when they returned to the cabin just before dark, Walter stopped short on the edge of the clearing. It was gone. Ash, char, smoke rising faint from blackened timber. The cabin had been reduced to ribs and ruin. Nothing left but stone and soot. No sign of the cellar hatch, no furniture, no photos, like it had never existed. Walter walked into the ruins slow. He crouched near what used to be the stove and touched the edge of a warped iron door. Still warm. Micah moved through the ashes quietly, his face unreadable. They didn't need to say it. This hadn't been nature. This hadn't been time. It had been erased. Deliberate. Erased like they were trying to wipe him out of memory, one ember at a time. When they reached town days later to resupply, Walter spoke carefully to the gas station owner, asked about trucks, men, smoke in the forest. The man blinked at him, polite but distant. "I ain't seen nothing, Walt," he said, wiping his hands on his vest. "Everything's been quiet up your way." "Always is." The others said the same. No one remembered the men. No one had heard engines. No one had seen fire. It was like it never happened, or like they had been told not to remember. But Walter did, and so did Micah, which meant the story wasn't over. It had only gone deeper underground, where roots live, where fire waits, where secrets don't die. They just change form. The wind had a different sound that night, less like movement, more like breath, close, steady, as if the forest itself was leaning in to listen. Walter sat by the fire in the new cabin he'd built with what tools he had left and what lumber the snow hadn't yet swallowed. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a roof that moaned under the weight of wind. A door he never latched completely, but it kept the cold out. Mostly. The flame crackled softly, throwing shadows that danced along the floor like memories. He hadn't spoken in hours, not since sunset, not since the sky turned that deep bruise purple above the ridge, not since he'd felt it again. That strange weight in his chest, like the air was thick with something he couldn't name. He'd fed the fire, brewed a cup of tea he wouldn't drink, sat in silence, listening, and then came the knock. Not on the door, but lower. 3 slow scrapes against the bottom edge of the frame. Then silence. Walter didn't move. Not at first. He reached for the shotgun almost out of instinct, his fingers closing around the cold stock. But something stopped him. Something deep in his bones. The sound wasn't threat. It was a message. He set the gun back down, stood slowly, stepped to the door, and opened it. The cold hit him first, sharp and immediate, but he barely registered it. What he saw took the breath from his lungs. Mika, older now, taller, shoulders broader, fur fuller, face more defined. No longer the wounded creature collapsed at his hearth. He stood with quiet strength, eyes calm, focused. But he wasn't alone. 3 smaller figures stood just behind him. 2 barely came up to his waist, 1 slightly taller, all of them covered in mottled fur of brown and gray. Their eyes were wide but steady. Not afraid, just unsure. Walter stepped back without a word. Micah entered first, ducking slightly beneath the frame. The others followed, staying close to his sides like shadows. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature shifted. Not warmer, exactly, but fuller. Like the room itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Micah stepped forward and pressed his forehead gently to Walter's. A single touch. Then he pulled back and looked at the children. Because that's what they were. Walter knew it in his gut. And motioned toward the corner near the fire where the blankets lay folded. One by one, they moved to it, settling into soft shapes, limbs tangled together, eyes never leaving Walter. He sat slowly in his rocker. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with something heavier. Awe, maybe, or the kind of grief that comes from seeing something beautiful too late. He looked at Mika again, studied the lines in his face. There was pain there, long road pain. Loss pain. But there was something else too. Resolve. A quiet dignity that Walter recognized in men who'd walked through hell and still knew how to build a fire. He gestured toward the kettle. I've got tea, if that's still your thing. Micah said nothing, but he sat. That was enough. The children ate in silence, tearing slowly through strips of smoked fish and boiled root. They made no sound. Not even when they chewed. But when Walter picked up the book of poems, the one he used to read aloud during the worst nights, they all turned toward him at once. He opened to a page he hadn't touched since Mary died. Cleared his throat. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. His voice shook on the 3rd line. The smallest child curled into the blanket. By the time he reached the last stanza, all 3 were asleep. The fire popped. Sparks danced up the chimney. Micah sat unmoving, eyes still fixed on Walter like he was memorizing every detail. Wrinkles, scars, breath. Where have you been? Walter finally asked. It wasn't a demand. It was a prayer. Micah slowly opened the pouch at his side and pulled out something small. A strip of bark, braided tight, almost identical to the one he wore the night Walter saved him. But this one was darker. Newer? He placed it in Walter's hand. Carved into its face were 5 marks, clean, precise. Walter traced them with his thumb. He didn't know what they meant exactly, but his heart knew. Family. Firelight flickered across the walls. The snow outside had started again, soft and soundless. Micah stood, crossed to the door, and opened it slightly. Then he let out a breath, a hum, low, rhythmic, like a song without melody. Built from wind and memory and time. The trees answered. Walter heard it. He stood too, stepped outside. The forest wasn't empty. They stood among the shadows. Shapes too tall, too still to be trees. Eyes reflecting starlight. Watching, not with menace, with mourning, with honor. Micah stepped out, raised his head, and gave a sound Walter would never forget. Not a howl, not a cry, a call. It echoed off the ridge like it had been waiting years to be spoken. And slowly, the figures stepped forward, just enough to be seen. They didn't come closer. They didn't need to. Walter looked back at Micah, and for the first time, he understood. He hadn't just saved a life. He'd returned a leader. The others nodded toward him. No words, but their eyes held more thanks than speech ever could. Later, when the night grew deep and the fire burned low, Micah approached Walter once more, held his forehead to his, same as before, then turned, placed a hand gently on each of the children, guided them toward the door. The last one, the smallest, paused, looked up at Walter. He reached out. Walter took his hand. It was warm, soft, real. The child stepped outside. Micah followed. But before crossing the threshold, he turned back, held up the braided bark token again, then pressed it against his heart. Walter nodded. Then Micah vanished into the snow. Walter stood at the open door for a long time, not because he was waiting, but because he wanted the night to remember. The cabin behind him was quiet, but not empty. He would build more blankets, more beds, keep the fire ready, not because he expected them back, but because now he understood. Some things return when they know the door is never fully closed. By the time the last snow started to melt, the forest had gone quiet in a different kind of way. Not dead quiet, not winter's stillness, but a kind of hush that came after something sacred had passed through, like the woods themselves were catching their breath. Walter stood out on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. Nothing fancy, just enough to stay warm, dry, and open to the world, and held the 3 rings in his hands, braided from his own gray hair and the ember-colored wool he'd unraveled from the old camp blanket. One for each of them, twisted carefully, tight and smooth. His fingers had started to shake more these days, but he still had enough precision to thread meaning into something small. He laid the first one into Ember's palm. She looked up at him with wide, steady eyes. Still small, but taller than the last time they met. Her fur was deeper now, richer, shot through with reddish gold light when the sun caught her just right. She closed her fingers around it, then pressed it gently to her chest like she knew what it meant. Moss was next. His hands were already dirty with soil, like he'd been playing in the old garden patch behind the cabin. He didn't speak. None of them did. But when Walter handed him the ring, he gave a low, soft hum from his throat. Not a word, but an acknowledgement. A tone Walter had come to recognize as their way of saying yes, or sometimes, I understand. Echo took the last one and didn't move for a long time, just stared at it. Then walked over to the big stone by the fire pit, sat cross-legged like Walter used to, and stared into the trees as if listening to something only he could hear. The forest that morning was awash of color. The snow hadn't fully retreated yet, but the ground was soft underfoot, the kind of soft that gave under boot but bounced back with moss. Patches of ferns had started to push through the thaw, stubborn and slow. Walter could hear the creek again, just barely, enough to know it was awake. He took them to the place where it had all started, just past the ridge, down into the basin where he'd first seen the pool, where Micah had laid down the old token on the flat stone, and where everything had shifted without a word. The children walked beside him now, not behind, not hiding. The trail wasn't worn, but they seemed to know it anyway. Their feet found the right places. Their eyes scanned the trees, but nothing startled them. They were home already. This was just the last stretch. Walter didn't speak much anymore on walks like this. He'd come to understand that silence in the right places was its own kind of offering. He let the birds carry the mood, let the wind speak when it wanted. Sometimes he'd say Mary's name, quietly, just to feel it again. When they reached the hollow, the trees opened like a breath. No sound, no motion, just the space. Micah was already there, standing at the edge of the water, arms crossed, head slightly bowed. He hadn't aged in the way Walter had. Not slower either, just different, like the weight of years collected in his eyes, not his bones. When he looked up and saw Walter, something passed between them that didn't need translation. They'd seen it through, the end of one life, the beginning of something else. Walter stepped closer and placed his hand against Micah's shoulder. You remember where I found you?" he asked. Micah nodded once. Walter looked back at the three small ones, now lined up quietly near the moss-ringed stones. "This is yours now," he said. "All of it." Micah turned toward him, then slowly reached into the small leather pouch slung across his side. From it, he pulled a stone. Flat, smooth, deep black. Not like obsidian, not like coal. It shimmered faintly with flecks of green and blue beneath the surface. He took Walter's hand, opened it, and laid the stone in his palm. It was warm. Walter stared at it a long moment. Then Micah did something he hadn't done before. He leaned in, touched his brow to Walter's, held it, longer than before. When he stepped back, the look in his eyes was not farewell. It wasn't even gratitude. It was recognition of something deeper than memory. Walter watched as the children gathered beside him. Micah gave them a quiet gesture, and without hesitation, they turned and began walking. Not toward the cabin, not toward the trail, but deep into the forest. Into the place where sound vanished and light bent strange. They didn't look back. He didn't call after them. Didn't need to. He stood there long after they'd vanished from sight, then walked back to the cabin alone. That night, he built the fire like always. Tea steeped, socks by the stove. The wind had picked up slightly, just enough to rattle the old window latch. He didn't fix it. He left the door ajar. Just a crack, enough for something to slip through if it wanted to. Not someone, not anymore, but something. The fire popped. He leaned back in the old rocker, the blanket pulled up over his knees. In the soft orange light, the stone still glowed faint in his hand. He'd set it on the mantel later. For now, he just held it. Out past the trees, the stars opened one by one. He didn't hear them come, but he felt it, the weight of something settling, the shape of a story folding into itself, a presence that wasn't company, but wasn't absence either. He let the fire burn low that night, kept the lamp turned low, didn't sleep, didn't need to. He was home. And home was not a roof or a fire or a name carved in wood. It was something left in the snow. It was something braided by hand. It was the space you keep warm even when you know they may never come back. But you still leave the door cracked anyway, just in case. Sometimes the most extraordinary truths don't roar into our lives. They arrive quietly, like snow settling on a cabin roof in the dead of winter. They come not with answers, but with presence. A breath in the silence, a warmth by the fire. And they remind us that not everything sacred can be named or understood or proven. Some things simply ask to be trusted. This story wasn't about monsters or myths, but about what happens when one soul chooses compassion in a world that has forgotten how to recognize it. It's about the invisible bridges we build, between fear and empathy, between what we are and what we might become. It's about how healing can grow from the smallest acts. A hand extended, a place made safe, a fire kept burning for someone who may never return. And maybe that's the lesson we're meant to hold on to. That kindness doesn't need recognition to matter. That sometimes the truest legacy we leave behind is the space we make for something else to live. In the quiet corners of this world, beyond the reach of roads or maps or memory, there are still stories unfolding in the dark. They don't always make headlines. They won't be found in textbooks or science journals. But they matter. They shape us. And they wait for those willing to see past fear, past difference, into something far older, far wilder, and far more honest. Thank you for joining us on this journey. One not just through wilderness, but through what it means to be human in the face of the unknown. If this story moved you, challenged you, or stayed with you in any way, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow our channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Sometimes the world speaks softly. All we have to do is leave the door open.